There's something quietly unsettling about the idea of pensioners being asked to prove themselves again. Not in a courtroom, not in some dramatic public inquiry, but through forms, documents, identity checks, eligibility reviews, small bureaucratic moments that individually seem perfectly reasonable, and yet together they create something heavier, something emotional, because for many older people in Britain, the promise of retirement was always supposed to represent stability, predictability, a kind of contract between citizen and state. And I think that's why this conversation around the Department for Work and Pensions potentially asking some pensioners for extra documents in 2026 feels bigger than it first appears. On paper, it sounds administrative, routine even. Governments update systems all the time, departments verify information, mistakes happen, fraud exists, records become outdated. None of this is entirely unusual, but the emotional atmosphere surrounding it tells a different story. You can almost feel the public hesitation before anyone has even fully explained what these checks may involve. Because people are tired. That's the thing people are starting to notice across Britain now. Fatigue has become political, emotional exhaustion has become political, whether it's rising costs, housing pressure, NHS waiting lists, energy bills, tax debates, or endless discussions about who qualifies for what support. There's this growing sense that ordinary people are constantly being asked to justify their existence to increasingly complicated systems, and pensioners occupy a particularly sensitive place in that conversation. For decades, older generations were often viewed as the most stable part of British society. They were the people who had done things properly, worked consistently, paid taxes, bought homes when homes still felt attainable, raised families during periods that, despite their difficulties, carried a stronger sense of long-term economic certainty than today. Retirement itself was imagined almost symbolically, not luxury exactly, but dignity. Now that certainty feels less solid. And honestly, I keep coming back to how quickly the tone of public administration has changed in recent years. There's been this quiet shift from service toward verification, from assumption toward suspicion. Institutions increasingly operate as though every system must constantly protect itself against misuse, which, in fairness, governments would argue is necessary. Public money matters, accuracy matters, fraud prevention matters. But emotionally, the experience for ordinary people can feel very different, especially for elderly citizens who may already struggle with digital systems, online portals, identity requirements, passwords, missing paperwork, changing regulations, or simply the anxiety of receiving an unexpected government letter. A request for additional documents may sound minor to policymakers, to someone in their late 70s. Living alone, it can feel deeply destabilizing. It's strange, because Britain has always had this complicated relationship with bureaucracy. The country prides itself on restraint and order and administrative competence, but there's also a long cultural memory of paperwork becoming impersonal, cold, detached from lived reality, and maybe that's the point. The real issue here may not be the documents themselves, it may be trust. Trust that the state still understands the people it serves. What's interesting is that reactions to these kinds of stories often reveal a generational divide that's becoming more visible across British politics. Younger people, particularly those who've grown up navigating endless verification systems online, may see document checks as normal, expected even, upload the file, confirm your identity, prove eligibility, move on. But many pensioners come from a generation where interactions with institutions were more human, more direct. There was often an assumption that systems recognized you rather than continuously reassessed you, and when that changes late in life, it can feel surprisingly personal. There's also a broader political tension underneath all of this. Britain is aging. The cost of pensions and welfare support remains a huge issue for governments already facing difficult economic choices. Every administration talks about sustainability, efficiency, fiscal responsibility. Those words appear constantly now, and yet behind those technical phrases are deeply human questions about obligation and dignity. How much support does society owe people after decades of contribution? And how much scrutiny is acceptable before support starts to feel conditional in a way people never expected? Because the conversation seems to be shifting towards something more transactional. Citizens increasingly feel measured through systems rather than known through experience. That's not unique to Britain, of course. It's happening across much of the modern world. Technology allows governments to monitor, verify, categorize, and cross-check people with extraordinary precision. In theory, that creates fairness. In practice, it can sometimes create emotional distance. And pensioners often feel that distance first, partly because many older people still approach government with a degree of seriousness that younger generations sometimes no longer possess. They still open official envelopes with concern. They still assume letters carry consequence. They still believe institutions should be respected. So when those institutions suddenly ask for additional proof or updated documentation, it can trigger something deeper than inconvenience. It touches identity, security, pride. And I think politicians understand this more than they sometimes admit publicly. Because pensioners remain one of the most politically influential groups in Britain, they vote consistently, they follow policy closely, they notice tone. Any perception that older citizens are being unfairly pressured or burdened tends to provoke strong reactions very quickly, which is why governments usually speak carefully around welfare reviews involving retirees. At the same time, there will absolutely be people who support stricter verification processes, and their arguments are not entirely unreasonable. Some will say public systems must adapt to modern realities, that errors cost taxpayers money, that identity fraud has increased, that outdated records create inefficiency, that fairness requires proper checks for everyone regardless of age. And honestly, many members of the public probably agree with aspects of that. This is what makes the issue politically delicate rather than straightforward. It sits in the uncomfortable space between administrative logic and emotional reality. A government can technically justify a policy while still underestimating how it feels to live through it. That distinction matters more than politicians often realize. Because public trust rarely collapses all at once anymore, it erodes gradually through atmosphere, through repeated moments where people begin feeling processed rather than protected. And there's this growing feeling that modern governance increasingly relies on systems that are efficient on paper but emotionally exhausting in practice. You see it everywhere now. People spending hours on hold trying to reach services that once had local offices, citizens navigating websites instead of conversations, automated responses replacing reassurance, verification replacing familiarity, the language of efficiency slowly overtaking the language of care. And perhaps pensioners feel this transition most sharply because they remember an earlier version of the social contract, a version where government felt physically present in communities, where local post offices mattered more, where public institutions carried stronger emotional legitimacy. That doesn't mean the past was perfect. Far from it, but it does mean expectations were different. Today, there's a strange contradiction at the center of modern Britain. People are being told to trust increasingly complex systems while simultaneously feeling less personally recognized by them, and maybe that contradiction explains why stories like this resonate so strongly even before details are fully confirmed, because people instinctively understand the symbolism. If pensioners, after a lifetime of work and contribution, now feel uncertain about navigating support systems, then what does that say about the wider direction of society? What does it say about security itself? And I think younger generations notice this too, even if differently. Many younger people already assume instability as a normal condition of life. Temporary work, expensive housing, constant reassessment, financial uncertainty. So watching pensioners experience similar anxieties creates a strange sense of convergence between generations that once felt politically divided. Everyone suddenly feels vulnerable to systems. That may be one of the deeper political themes emerging here. Not simply whether document checks happen, but how modern states increasingly interact with citizens through continuous verification. The assumption now is that records must constantly be updated, identities constantly confirmed, eligibility constantly reassessed. In administrative terms, that may seem rational. Socially, though, it changes the emotional texture of citizenship itself. You become less a known member of society and more an active file requiring maintenance, and honestly, that can feel lonely. Particularly for older people already dealing with isolation, bereavement, declining health, or anxiety about the future. A request for additional paperwork can arrive not merely as administration, but as another reminder that life has become harder to navigate, another reminder that confidence fades when systems stop feeling intuitive. Of course, none of this means governments should never review records or modernize procedures. Most people understand practical realities, but communication matters enormously, tone matters enormously. The difference between reassurance and intimidation can sometimes be nothing more than wording, and maybe that's where this story ultimately becomes bigger than pensions. It becomes a reflection of how societies treat people when they are no longer economically central, when productivity slows, when age replaces momentum. Do older citizens feel respected by institutions or managed by them? Do they feel seen as individuals or categories? Those questions linger far beyond one policy discussion. Because beneath all the debates about budgets and eligibility and administration is something fundamentally emotional. People want to feel secure in the systems they spent their lives supporting. They want to believe that aging will not automatically mean confusion, suspicion, or bureaucratic stress, and perhaps that's why this issue has touched such a nerve, not because document requests themselves are necessarily dramatic, but because they arrive during a moment when many people already feel the ground shifting beneath them economically, politically, socially, emotionally. The stability people once imagined at the end of life no longer feels guaranteed, and maybe that's the quiet truth. Sitting underneath this entire conversation, people are not only worried about paperwork, they're worried about what the paperwork represents. And in the years ahead, governments will probably continue modernizing systems anyway, but the real test may not be technological efficiency. It may be whether ordinary people still feel dignity inside those systems, whether retirement still feels like safety rather than administration, because once citizens begin associating aging with constant verification, something important in the relationship between state and society quietly changes over time.